Hi, I'm Niles Rogoff, and today me and my buddy Scott are going to tell you guys all about one of the scandals that Verizon got tripped up in a couple years ago, where they started adding a what the media called a super cookie to every single request made by every single one of their customers. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how that was implemented and what that means in terms of net neutrality, and then Scott is going to follow that up with some of the ethical implications that actually came out of it. So, in terms of how it actually works, this is what it looks like when your web browser, sometimes called a user agent because it works on your behalf, goes to get a web page, right? Let's say I went to example.com/about.html. This is exactly what my web browser would send. And all it's doing is it's telling example.com a couple things about what I want to get. That I want to get about.html, that I am running Chrome 74, that I can accept these types of encodings, things that the server might actually need to know to send back the response to my request. And what started happening a couple years ago is that customers of Verizon started seeing an extra header added to the top of their request. And it looked like some garbage. And it looked like an XUHID header, which didn't exist before. It was something that Verizon made up, and just started injecting into every single unencrypted request. So this, I'm going to make an analogy here, where I start talking about how, this was a scandal not because an extra header started appearing in people's requests, but because of what Verizon would have had to do to make that happen. So when you send a network packet, any packet over the internet, it pretty much almost always follows this diagram. There's an internet version, there's some identification, and the important stuff, or what should be important to the Verizon, is these two fields right here, the source address and the destination address. So these fields in your packet tell Verizon, this is the site that I want to send this packet to. And the analogy that I'm going to make is that your packet is basically an envelope, and you are handing it to the mail service, right? And the mail service can look at the outside of the envelope to determine the destination for that message, right? The mail service knows exactly where to go. But the problem is that in order to actually add this header to the message that we see coming out the other side, Verizon would have had to not just look at the address on the envelope. They would have had to open the envelope. That is to say, look at this actual data being sent between you and the server, not just the destination, but the actual contents of your envelope, right? The letter that you're sending. And then they would have had to add stuff, right? You sent this letter, and you expected that the mail service would deliver that letter. And what they actually did is they opened it, they added in more stuff that you did not want to write in that letter, and then they delivered that letter as if nothing had ever happened, as if they had just passed it along with no modification. And the sender of the message never knows that their message was actually tampered with, and the receiver of the message doesn't necessarily know either, right? All they know is that something changed. And so here's just sort of a high-level overview. Ideally, here's the internet provided by Verizon. You send your request along to some website, and the website sends your response back. But here, with this man-in-the-middle technique that they added, they actually decode your entire HTTP request, add that header, and then forward it along, and then man-in-the-middle the responses as well. So they have the ability to do a lot more, right? Just by opening up this envelope, they gain the ability to not just add tracking headers, but to also do things like read the contents of your request, see what websites you're visiting and what you're doing on them, and even in some cases they could collect credentials that you use when you log into a website, because they're man-in-the-middling those as well. And so from a net neutrality point of view, this was bad to begin with, because they're already doing things to your traffic that you did not want them to be doing. But then these servers that are receiving this extra, UHID header on the other end, they can take that UHID header and they can pay Verizon to tell them multiple things, including what Verizon customer you are based on your customer ID, and what product Verizon thinks you would be interested in, right? Advertising categories, because Verizon already obviously knows every single website that you're visiting. And so, Verizon created this own little market for themselves, not just because, not, these sites were specifically paying Verizon to have that information revealed based on this header. So now that I've told you a little bit about how the system actually worked, Scott is going to take it away to talk about some of the ethical implications and what came out of this scandal.
After it was made public that Verizon was taking people's information without them knowing and not giving them a way to opt out of it, they were actually charged $1.35 million by the FCC for violating the terms of net neutrality and not informing their customers. This obviously garnered a lot of negative media attention, as privacy on the internet is a hot topic today in media, and this gave Verizon a very negative outlook in the months to follow, which severely impacted their stock price. Also, for the 3 years following this fine, there were actually stricter guidelines on what Verizon had to do when it came to cookies and using their customers' information. They had to explicitly label what information they were going to use and gain explicit permission to use each and every piece of information. In terms of what Verizon had to say about this fine, they basically said that the UIDH doesn't actually contain any personal identifiable data, and that it doesn't broadcast individuals' historical web browsing activity to advertisers or others. Basically, what this means is they're saying, yes, this had some information, but it's not personal information, and it's not information that could really be used against you, and it's not the typical invasion of privacy that a lot of people tend to think of when it comes to violations of privacy on the internet. And basically, they thought that this wasn't too big of a deal. Obviously, it was to a lot of people, and they did have to pay the $1.35 million fine to the FCC. In terms of ethical concerns, something to take note of is that Verizon wasn't actually fined for the cookies themselves. That's perfectly legal. They were fined for not telling users that they were using these cookies and not giving them an option to opt out of the program. It's this low, under the covers sort of tracking of information that is very unethical to the FCC, and what ended up getting them fined and garnering all of this negative media attention. In the words of the chief of the FCC Enforcement Bureau at the time, consumers care about privacy and should have a say in how their personal information is used, especially when it comes to who knows what they're doing online. Basically, people shouldn't be tracked if they don't know that they're being tracked. And like I said before, this was a violation of the transparency rule of net neutrality, which basically says that people know where their information is going. Another famous time where this transparency rule was broken was in the 2015 wireless speed throttling case of AT&T, where they were slowing down the internet speeds of people who had unlimited wireless plans after a certain amount of data usage. And AT&T was actually fined $100 million for this. So obviously a lot of ethical concerns and things to think about this case. Questions will be below, and we encourage you to answer them after thinking about the issue.